Good morning. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to the Thompson Center on Public Leadership's presentation of Leadership and Geopolitics, Navigating the Challenges with Admiral James Stavridis. I'm Captain John Barnett, Commanding Officer of the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps at the University of Wisconsin, where we educate and train the future officers of our nation's Navy and Marine Corps to serve with honor and to assume the highest responsibility of command, citizenship, and government. I'm truly grateful for the Thompson Center's generous support in bringing such an experienced and relevant voice to the University of Wisconsin and to afford our future leaders an opportunity to hear directly from the man who literally wrote the book on the command at sea. With that, I'm very happy to introduce the director of the Thompson Center, John Stavridis.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. As Captain Burnett said, I'm Alex Stock. I'm the director of the Thompson Center on Public Leadership. The Thompson Center is really delighted to be able to sponsor today's event and to be able to partner with the University of Wisconsin Reserve Officers Training Corps to bring Admiral Stavridis to campus here today. I really want to thank Captain Barnett and everybody at the Naval ROTC here for making this possible, as well as the Thompson Center staff with NCF for all they've done. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few words about it quickly. The Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. To follow in his legacy, we seek to inspire and inform current and future public leaders, foster leadership skills, and advance effective public policy. To that end, we host events, both small events and large. We fund scholarships and research and conduct other activities all throughout the University of Wisconsin system. We are also currently soliciting proposals for scholarships, research grants, and speaker grants, and I encourage anybody interested in any of our grant opportunities to consider applying if you are affiliated with the University of Wisconsin School, including, of course, Madison. So, for more information about our upcoming events, grant opportunities, and other activities and aspects of the center, please see our website. Today, I am honored to be able to introduce Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral Stavridis began his long naval career graduating from the Naval Academy in 1976. Early in his career, he also received his doctorate in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts in 1984. He commanded the destroyer USS Barry from 1993 to 1995, which saw deployments to Haiti, Bosnia, and the Persian Gulf. And under his command, the Barry received the Battenberg Cup, given annually to the best ship or submarine in the Atlantic Fleet. In 1998, he commanded Destroyer Squadron 21 and received the Naval League John Paul Jones Award for inspirational leadership. He commanded the Enterprise Carrier Strike Group from 2002 to 2004, during which time the group conducted combat operations in support of both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. From 2006 to 2009, he commanded the U.S. Southern Command, which oversees all military operations in Latin America. And in 2009, he became Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, a position he held until his retirement from the Navy in 2013. After that, he became Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, where he received his doctorate. He stepped down from that position in 2018. He has, since retirement, written 5 books, I believe soon another, several of which have been best-selling and over 100 articles. He's a frequent commentator on national security and foreign policy questions, and an active Twitter user. It's my pleasure now to introduce an amazing public leader, Admiral James Stavridis.
Well, good morning, everybody. A delight to be with you, and particularly to the midshipmen and cadets here. My daughter, Julia, went through the NROTC program at Georgetown University in Washington. I know the quality of these programs, and I honor the fact that you have chosen to stand and deliver for the nation. So thank you. Join me in a round of applause. Alex, thank you for a very gracious introduction. Normally when people hear that introduction, you know, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and so on, then they actually see me. And they typically have two reactions. One is, man, I thought you'd be taller than me. And the second one is, they say, well, you know, Stavridis, if you're really that cool, why were you not a naval aviator? You know, like Goose and Maverick. And, you know, truth be told, I really wanted to be a naval aviator, like XO, the unit here in that. But I was a surface officer, right? Drove ships, kind of like the captain, John and I. But in my heart, I always wanted to be an aviator. And unfortunately, I had a really traumatic experience when I was a young boy that made aviation difficult. So here's what we're going to do this morning. I'm going to kind of walk around the horizon with you. We're going to talk a little bit about the global challenges that we're seeing. We're going to start, of course, with Ukraine. But then more importantly, what I'd like to do, particularly for the ROTC students here, I'd like to focus on leadership and think about what are the qualities of leadership we need to deal with the challenges that face us today as a nation. So with that as a premise, I'm going to start with the current problem in the world, and that would be right there, Vladimir Putin. There's a bit of magical thinking out there that, NATO expansion is what caused Russia to invade Ukraine. That is nonsense. Russia invaded Ukraine to fulfill the ego and the ambition of Vladimir Putin. This, by the way, is Putin when I first met him about 10, 12 years ago. He was, to quote Shakespeare, a lean and hungry man. He's not anymore. He's puffy, kind of in a medical sort of way. He's angry, he's frustrated. But I want to stipulate, he's not crazy. This is not Mad King George with nuclear weapons. But he has chosen to create a war and invade this country. Now this is Ukraine. We've all learned a lot about Ukraine in the last 2 months, right? Did you ever think you would be able to glance at a map of Ukraine and immediately know where Lviv is? You know where Mariupol is, a doomed city that will fall tragically, but where the defenders will heroically stay till the final moments, like the Allies, like the 300 Spartans of Thermopylae. This is, in every sense, a Shakespearean drama playing out in front of us. And I think most folks know the outlines of the conflict. And most folks have seen these kind of terrible pictures, know what's happening. The real question is, how is the West responding? I think we're doing a fairly good job. If you had told me 3 months ago, 4 months ago, that this invasion would occur and that in the aftermath of the invasion, the West would hold together so strongly on sanctions, I would have been surprised. Even more on the military end of this thing. The capability that is being flooded into the hands of the Ukrainians is staggering. This, of course, is Volodymyr Zelensky, a former convict. And by the way, I like Zelensky a lot. He's 5 feet 5 inches tall. I see everything. I see everything eye to eye with Zelensky. Vladimir Putin completely underestimated this person, who has turned out to be almost Churchill in his responses. It's a remarkable vision of leadership. And for, again, the midshipmen and cadets here, you could do worse than to think consciously about Zelensky and how he is approaching the challenges he faces. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But in addition to the center of gravity of this fight, which is the Ukrainian will and spirit, we, the West, are putting these weapons in their hands. And by the way, I think you'll see the president announce, perhaps today, an additional tranche of even more capable weapons to go to our friends in Ukraine. And they're having real effect. You know, as a surface Navy officer, I know this ship well. This was a Slava-class cruiser. Its name was Moskva, which means Moscow in Russian. And I studied this ship during the Cold War. It's a very capable warship. It was the flagship of the Black Sea. Today, it's at the bottom of the Black Sea, along with probably about 400 of the 500 crew members. Why? Because of the weapons that we are providing. And also, NATO has held together. Again, a third surprise to me. I really felt, even as a former Supreme Allied Commander, that NATO would start to kind of fray, pull apart. Boy, that hasn't happened. NATO is pushing real combat capability to the borders of Russia as a deterrent to Vladimir Putin, as our president said. Don't even think about it. Good signal. But more importantly, how about a flag drill? What two countries are those? Finland and Sweden, right? Not NATO members, about to join. That's pretty remarkable. When I was NATO commander, I commanded, obviously, the NATO mission in Afghanistan. In addition to NATO troops, we had troops from allies, partners. Finland and Sweden, just remarkable combat soldiers, remarkable combat aviators, extraordinary capability. The defense budget, by the way, of Finland and Sweden combined is about 25% of the whole Russian defense budget. So Putin's invasion is not only costing him men, women in combat, but also combat capability, as well as encouraging other nations to join NATO. So again, I've been pleasantly surprised at how it's held together. But is it over? No. Putin is going to fight on. He has many tricks up his sleeve. Here are a couple of them. Upper left, chemical weapons, symbol. Will he use a chemical weapon? He might. In the center, you see a general. This is Alexander Kornikov. I know him well. When I was a NATO commander, he was a one-star general in the Russian army. He was notorious for the brutality, for the war criminal behavior, both in Chechnya and in Afghanistan, and most importantly in Syria. Bottom left, Putin still controls the sea. He still has options to swing around behind Ukrainian forces. And bottom right, think about those characters showing up in your neighborhood. Those are Chechens. They are comparable to Syrians, to the Wagner group, which is a horrific mercenary group funded by Russia. All of this shows you where Putin is going. He will continue to put aggressive, almost terrorist level actions against the population of this nation. So this hangs in the balance, and I would argue this is one of the two biggest challenges we face today. We also ought to worry about China. And here, I want to begin by simply pointing out how China and Russia are drawing closer and closer together, operating militarily together. This is going to be very important to watch what President Xi decides to do, how How far will he go, President Xi of China, in supporting Vladimir Putin? We'll see. I think the Chinese, who are watching the failures of the Russian army thus far, are, shall we say, less enthusiastic about providing extreme support. But make no mistake, the strategic challenge for the United States in this century will be the rise of China. And unfortunately, we have a pretty rich basket of disagreements with China. You know, in a better world, U.S. and China would be working together to solve climate, to face the pandemic. Unfortunately, that's not the world we have. We have, between the United States and China, a kind of shadow war in cyber upper left. We see intellectual property theft occurring upper right. Bottom right, trade and tariffs. My good friend, Professor Dean Mike Knetter here from the business school will tell you about the impact of these tariff and trade disputes. Bottom left, you may not recognize. That's an artificial island. China is building these in the South China Sea. In effect, they are unsinkable aircraft carriers. And it is part of China's claim to the entire South China Sea. Because the Chinese are building a fleet. There are already more warships in the Chinese Navy than in the U.S. Navy, for example. And they're building not only nuclear-powered carriers, they're building aircraft carriers, nuclear-powered, and their aim is right here. It's to control the South China Sea as territorial waters. That is a preposterous claim. China, however, feels they're going to own this body of water, and this is huge. The South China Sea is half the size of the United States of America. Think the continental United States. That's the size of the South China Sea. It's full of hydrocarbons, oil, gas. 40% of the world's shipping passes through it. Full of fisheries. That's why they're building these artificial islands that you see here. That will continue. The shadowy cyber war will continue. The intellectual property theft will continue. What aircraft is that at the top? There, folks. That's a Joint Strike Fighter, an F-35 Light. It's the best fighter in the world, full stop. The one at the bottom, that's a Chinese J-22. Looks exactly like it because the stealth characteristics were hacked from Lockheed Martin. We also disagree with China about human rights, particularly the imposition of near genocidal conditions upon Uyghurs, Muslims who live in northwest China. And then finally, Taiwan. What's the future of Taiwan? A democracy, a very vibrant one, very independent-minded. China sees them as a rogue province. All of this, everything I've just mentioned, is part of this strategic challenge for the United States. So Russia, China, and third, Iran. Iran. This is a Sahel-2 missile. I don't expect many would recognize it. It's a long-range ballistic missile. Iran is continuing to build ballistic missiles, undermine the region, and create a real sense of regional power. And here's our problem. We tend to think of Iran as this kind of annoying, mid-sized power. And you're looking at that map and you're thinking, okay, Admiral is showing me where the Iranians are active. No. That map could have been made 2,500 years ago. It's the Persian Empire at its greatest extent. Our problem is we think of the Iranians as this kind of mid-level power. That's not how they view themselves. They view themselves as an imperial power. As a Greek American, by the way, I'm required to point out Greece was never conquered by the Persians. Point being, Iran is going to continue to create immense tension in this region. We may be on the cusp of returning to a nuclear deal with Iran, but whether we do or do not, unfortunately, along with China and Russia, as we've talked about, look for Iran to be a problem. So fourth and finally, as we look at national challenges to which we're going to apply this idea of leadership, fourth and finally, how about this guy? Kim Jong-un. He's well named. He's unpredictable. He's morbidly obese, but he's lost weight, now he's put it back on. He's got a really bad haircut. He's kind of holding it back. But he's gotten into the weapons, folks, 50 roughly. And he increasingly has the ability to deliver in the range. So if we look at the world like that sailor with binoculars at the front, I think those are four challenges for the United States. What else should we be concerned about? I would argue cyber. In fact, I've been surprised that we have not seen a significant cyber attack come out of the war in Ukraine. I fear that one is coming. Everyone these days will recognize that Ukrainian flag, right? There's my Ukrainian flag pocket square. Everyone recognizes that. Along the bottom are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Republic of Georgia, a small democracy in the Caucasus. What do they have in common? They're all democracies. They're all former republics of the USSR, and they have all undergone a cyber attack from Russia in the last 5 years. Significant cyber attack, one that goes after their grid. You want to read one book, by the way, about our vulnerabilities, our electric grid? Check this one out by Gretchen Dodd. This is a dimension of warfare that is at least as concerning as those nations that I mentioned. And then lastly, to round out the scale of woe, the environment poses national security challenges as well. Climate change is real. Global warming is real. And I tell you that not as a climatologist, not as a scientist, I tell you that as a mariner. I've sailed these waters. The ice is melting. And as a result, sea levels are going to rise. Our critical strategic ports are going to be flooded. We're going to see droughts that create instability in many parts of the world. We're going to see tensions in the high north, in the Arctic, as the ice melts. And these vast strategic traps open up to competition between Russia and NATO at the top of the world. So in addition to those nations, in addition to cyber, we ought to be concerned about the environment. And lastly, as if we needed this lesson, we ought to be concerned about pandemics, about Mother Nature, about another pandemic. There are significant national security aspects to this. So when I put all that together, I'd say right about now, you ought to say, whew, okay, Admiral. I'm kind of worried about all that. What do you think? What are the tools of leadership that can be applied to these problems, but also applied to our own lives? So with that, let me show you the number one quality of a leader. Number one quality. Right there. It's listening. Great leaders are great listeners. This is what we see Vladimir Putin failing today. He's not listening to his inner circle. He's not listening to those who would advise him, both from outside his world and inside his world. Great leaders are great listeners. By the way, this is not Photoshop. This photograph taken in the 1930s is a Belgian air defense system. That officer is listening for incoming aircraft. It's innovative if you think about it. I put it here as a metaphor. Great leaders are great listeners. What else? Great leaders are great leaders. Because let me tell you something. Here I'm really speaking to the midshipmen and the cadets. You're incredibly lucky to be at this extraordinary university, and you're presented with the gift of time to study and to learn and to read. But here's my point. The day you graduate is the day that you own your education. Right now, you're sharing ownership of it with a terrific faculty, with advisors, with the ROTC units. People are telling you what to read all the time. The day you graduate, that stops, and you own that education. And the sooner you start thinking about education as a lifelong experience into which you build more intellectual capital every day and week of your life, the better a leader you will be. Here are some books I've read and enjoyed lately. I'll provide these to the organizers, but I particularly want to highlight a magazine called The Economist. It comes out every week. It is a print, also available online, kind of expensive. Typically, for the students here, you can access it, of course, through the library system here. Let me tell you how good The Economist magazine is. When I was Supreme Allied Commander, every day at 10 o'clock in the morning, a young officer, either a Navy lieutenant or an Air Force captain, would show up, knock on my door, and would hand me a binder. That binder contained the President's Daily Intelligence Brief. It was the high-grade, highest-grade intelligence that the nation had. I saw it, the President saw it, the Vice President, the Director of the CIA produced it, went to a tiny handful. I saw it every day for 4 years. Every week, I would read The Economist. And I mean, really read it, go through it page by page. I got paper copies because I like to tear them out, underline things, and stick them in a drawer to get back to, etc. Every week I read The Economist. Overlap between those two publications, 85 to 90%. Point being, if you are reading The Economist and really diving into it, you are obtaining 85 to 90% of what the president sees. That's a powerful tool, particularly for a young officer trying to understand what's happening. So my point is simple. Remember to continue to read. And by the way, not just nonfiction. Find time to read fiction as well. Novels for leaders are amazing tools. You get to put yourself in them, like in a simulator, and say to yourself, upper left, To Kill a Mockingbird. Now that's a book most folks read when they're 15 years old, right? Go back and reread that in 10 years. And the Plains Native Americans say we never cross the same river twice because the river moves on. It's the same with the book. You go back and read it again. I came back in my 50s and reread To Kill a Mockingbird. It's about race in America. It's about a young woman coming of age. It's about integrity and truth. It's about the justice system. Does that sound like a relevant book these days? Boy, is it. You want to understand what it's like to be in a harsh, authoritarian, patriarchal society? Pick up the novel, Handmaid's Tale, or the sequel, Testaments, by Margaret Atwood. The point is, your reading diet ought to have both nonfiction and fiction. And find time to read a few books about leadership. It is a skill. It is a learnable art. There are, again, some books that I particularly enjoy. Again, the point is not these particular books, it's the idea of reading. So, leaders are listeners, leaders are readers, and leaders are team leaders. This, of course, is the big table at NATO. I sat around it for 4 years. You haven't had a leadership experience until you're trying to convince the Bulgarians and the Icelanders to provide more troops to go to Afghanistan. Point being, team building, understanding culture, understanding other languages. The second language of the NATO alliance is French. I'm lucky, I went to French school when I was very small in Athens, Greece, long story, but I was able to speak in both languages in the alliance structure. So that study of languages, culture, history helps leaders be team builders. And of course, it's not just the very formal structure of NATO. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. Almost 80 nations are in this. You see flags not only from Europe, but from the Pacific, from the Middle East. Together, we have pushed the Islamic State back into the box. And, you know, so often in the world of security, international relations, and in our lives, we go sprinting by our successes onto the next problem. And that's okay. But we had to pause for a minute and say, we beat the Islamic State. 4 years ago, they were driving tanks into Baghdad. They were 50 kilometers outside of Baghdad. Today, they're largely a spent force. So why? Because of teamwork, because of coalitions. And by the way, in that regard, you have to think about new partners. This golden temple in Amritsar is sacred to the Sikh faith. I would argue India is a potential extraordinary partner for the United States, a fellow democracy, powerful demographics, certainly lots of challenges. But as we build these teams, including formal alliances, informal alliances, we ought to be thinking about non-traditional partners. India, I think, is very important. What else do we consider as leaders? International organizations. This is a group that was built in the 1950s about no Chevys appealing. No Chevys, by the way, that photograph is taken in Havana, where the Chevys are now tourist attractions. You can ride around Quaywall, Havana, it's kind of fun. But I put it here to remind us that those institutions, the World Bank, the United Nations, NATO itself, all of them were created in another era. But like those Chevys, they're still on the road. They're still functioning. They're still part of our solution set. So as leaders, it's a reminder to us to look at the organizations, consider their capabilities, and bring them to the fight the same way we bring these other allies, partners, and friends. What else? Do we need a strong military to deal with these challenges? Yes, we do. But I would argue our military is going to look a little bit different going forward. Now this is a really terrible movie. I highly do not recommend it. It's Harrison Ford's worst film ever. It's a terrific novel, however, a novel of leadership. And what's it about? It's about a cyber force, kind of a space force. We've got a new flag up here, by the way. It's about young people stepping up for their country, for their society, for their civilization. I would argue we are going to need another flag pretty soon to raise cyber force. That's coming. Each of the services, as this group will know, have pretty robust cyber information kinds of cores built into the services. My view, just like we hit the point of realization that we need a space force, we're about to realize we need a cyber force. So that new military, which will continue to have some of these traditional platforms, I think will have more of a cyber look to it, more unmanned platforms, more artificial intelligence. And I would argue this, the tactical triad that is helping the Ukrainians defeat the Russians, in addition to all the missiles and all the hard kill stuff, it's also cyber. There's a lot of that going on under the radar. It's unmanned vehicles and special forces. Anybody know who this is? What's the men's group? This is Lieutenant Michael Murphy, ABC. He died in Afghanistan in 2008, where he was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. He was part of a mission that went terribly wrong. He was forced to make very hard choices on the battlefield. He did so with immense honor and is the subject of a brilliant film that I highly recommend. Michael Murphy's story is well worth it. I put him here not only because he symbolizes young men and women who are willing to go forward for us, but also because of special forces. When you connect special forces to unmanned, to cyber, to space, that's the new queen of the battlefield. So all of that will be part of the tool set that must be applied. Finally, a couple other thoughts about what some call soft power. Soft power, as opposed to what we just spoke about, the hard power of military operations. Soft power is hospital ships, opening schools. It is building wells and clinics. It's participating with our allies, partners, and friends in rule of law exercises. This is the hospital ship Comfort. She deployed under my command several times. Was commander of the U.S. Southern Command to Latin American Caribbean. She is a gorgeous example of team building, of soft power, of having real impact. And I'll give you an example. When Comfort would pull into a port in Latin America, let's say in Nicaragua, we would set up clinics. And so people would come from all over, in this case Nicaragua, to see the clinics. And so one day I was visiting the ophthalmology clinic, and a mother has appeared with an 8-year-old boy. And she's explaining to the doctor in Spanish, my son can't really see very well, everything is blurry in the distance. So the ophthalmologist quickly examined him, and she saw almost immediately he had simple myopia. Here's which I am as well, more in context. So she quickly flipped on a little pair of glasses, and this little boy looked up, and you could tell he could suddenly see every leaf on the tree individually. It was incredible to watch his face, and he turned to his mother and he said, Mama, veo el mundo. I see the world. Think about that for a minute. Every act of grace like that shows the United States to be a compassionate power, a competent power, a nation that cares about its neighbors. That is also part of leadership for security in this 21st century. And I'll give you one other example of it from Afghanistan, where our mission failed. We need to recognize that. We tried both hard power and soft power, and we could spend another hour talking about Afghanistan and our failures there. And we need to look them directly in the eye and understand them and improve. But one thing we did right is here. And you're looking at that thinking, well, that's funny. Afghans with books. I thought I read somewhere that a lot of Afghans were illiterate. And you'd be correct. The Taliban withheld education from big segments of Afghan society. So they have a very difficult literacy problem. So what is this? This is literacy class. We are teaching, we, NATO, United States, NGOs, are teaching these young Afghans to read and write. We taught millions of young Afghans to write. This may be the most lasting thing we do in Afghanistan. And I think it will be part, even under the Taliban, of moving that society forward. So last tool I want to mention, and then we'll open it up for some comments and questions. This world is very important to our security. Now you're looking at that, you're thinking, okay, he's a retired admiral, these must be sea lanes of communication, shipping routes. No. Maybe airline routes, ICAO routes? No. maybe fiber optic cables up in the ocean. That'd be a good guess, but there's too many. Only 300 cables carry the whole internet. This is Facebook. The world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. 2.4 billion people are on Facebook. The tell, if you're a poker player, is that China is dark, because China controls the social networks. And I'm not carrying a brief for Facebook here. My point is, it's about the social networks upon which 4 to 6 billion people are engaging out of the global population of just over 7 billion. This is the largest communications bridge ever built. And we have got to be there. Because here's the bad news. The bad news is that I'm also showing you the command and control network of what's left of the Islamic State. This is where they built their forces. They recruited, they proselytized, they conducted operations, massacres in Europe and the Middle East using these social networks. So we have to be in there as well. And you know, I mention this, and a lot of times people say, oh yeah, Admiral, you're right, it's a war of ideas. Not quite. It's a marketplace of ideas. We gotta compete, because there are competing visions out there from authoritarian states, from radicalized religious groups, from conspiracy theorists. There are other competing narratives. Ours is good. Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute those values imperfectly, but they're the great values. And they can compete in this world. And we gotta do it at scale. And we gotta do it one-on-one. This is me about 9 years ago as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. I'm there with my opposite number, the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces, General Nikolai Makarov. I was like General Makarov, as you can see, he's a man of normal height. I had this was actually an important meeting. We were discussing submarine operations in the Arctic. You see us looking at the globe there. And we were very careful about deconflicting operations, let's put it that way. We need this. We need those open communications. You have to be able to speak with your opposite numbers. So the point is, we have to move these ideas at scale, and we have to move them one-on-one. These values matter. They come to us from the ancient Greeks. They come to us, some from the East, from the Buddha's teachings. They drop through the Enlightenment. That's the young Voltaire on the right. They come through our founding fathers to principled leaders like Angela Merkel, 4-term chancellor of Germany. So all of this, everything we've talked about, is hard. Again, I'm Greek American, so I'm required to have a Greek myth in every presentation. Here it is, Sisyphus. Leadership is that boulder that will roll down on you. And I have failed myself too many times to count in my career. The measure of anybody is not how you do when everything's easy, when the sun is shining. The measure of anybody is how you do when the boulder rolls down. The tools we've talked about here, I would argue, apply at the highest levels of our geopolitics, and they apply equally well in the day-to-day lives that we all lead, around kitchen tables, classrooms, shopping malls. You ought to listen. You ought to have built intellectual capital. You ought to ponder leadership. You ought to be creative and innovative. You ought to be compassionate. And you ought to be resilient. Those are the tools you need. And how fast should you go in this life? Pretty damn fast. That's a cheetah. It's the fastest thing on earth. It'll go from 0 to to 60 miles an hour in 2.5 seconds. And look at it. It's optimized for speed, right? Its head is shaped like an axe. It literally cuts through the air to cut down aerodynamics. It's got very powerful front legs. It's got a huge rib cage to process all of that oxygen pulsing through its lungs. Huge back legs. Oops. Wait a minute. Look at the tail on the cheetah. If you are creating the fastest thing on Earth by evolution or creationism, take your pick, why would you give a cheetah a massive tail? Why doesn't it have like no tail, no drag, or maybe just like a little decorative bunny tail? Why does it have that tail? Well, for the engineers in the crowd, you'll understand it has that tail because when it accelerates and then tries to turn, if it can't counterbalance with that tail, again, look at the size of the tail of the cheetah. If it can't counterbalance, it just goes tumbling into the undergrowth. So the point is, as leaders, you go fast. You have to in this world. But you gotta stay in balance. Last image. And I want you to remember this. If you remember nothing else about our hour or so this morning, I want you to remember a quote. And I'll set it up with this photograph. This photograph, by the way, was selected from tens of thousands of photographs 5 years ago as the top journalistic photograph of the year. These are migrants. They're standing on the edge of the Red Sea. They're trying to get to the next stop on the journey from Africa. Eventually, they hope to Europe. Prosaically, what's happening is they're holding up their cell phones, trying to get a better signal. Metaphorically, what's happening? They're reaching for the light. They're hoping to get to the next stage of their very difficult journey. This is a photo of hope. And so my last thought for you as leaders is to share with you a quote from Napoleon. And I love to quote Napoleon because short people have to stick together. Napoleon said, "A leader is a dealer in hope. A leader is a dealer in hope. Not in fear, not in anger. A leader is a dealer in hope. Be that kind of leader. I know you will. I hope these tools help you, and I'm very proud to look at all you young men and women who have chosen to wear the cloth of your nation. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot. We've got time to jump into any of the topics you want to explore, geopolitics, leadership, anything at all. Who would like to pose a question? Yes, sir.
Sir, Cadet Keeler, I'm the Army ROTC program here. You presented a myriad of national security challenges. In the next 20 years, what would you say the composition and disposition of U.S. military posture should be? For more specifically, how do you balance our commitments to the NATO alliance and our European allies while realigning to the Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. First and foremost, we need to recognize, as we talked about, the rising strategic challenge of China. That's really the big strategic focus for us. So what we should be doing is building alliances in the Pacific, not only the existing ones we have with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, many others, but also, as we talked about, pulling India in our direction. A mechanism to do that is something called the Quad. The Quad is a relatively new idea in geopolitics and diplomacy. It is an alignment, not a formal treaty, but an alignment between Australia, Japan, United States, and India. India is predisposed to kind of come in this direction because they are concerned, appropriately, about China. So the Quad, diplomatically, in terms of capability, again, cyber, unmanned, space, special forces, I would argue, forgive me, maritime, because with China, it's going to be a maritime kind of engagement. And all those forces are for deterrence. We're not going to invade China. We're not going to attack China. We are going to position our forces forward so that they can deter China from taking actions that we would prefer them not to. And then third and finally, I think there's a significant economic component in all this. We have to maintain our capability to produce artificial intelligence, tech, quantum computing, which is going to reshape the internet, machine learning, along with the more prosaic actions of trade. All of those are how we need to position ourselves for China. In terms of NATO, I think we've covered that pretty well. That's using that incredible alliance. And by the way, let me just do a commercial for NATO for 1 second. I think occasionally people say, oh gosh, Russia and NATO probably have roughly the same military capability. If you ask a lot of Americans, they'd say, oh, it must be pretty close. It's not even close. Russia spends $60 to $70 billion a year on defense. The United States spends $700 billion. Our European allies spend $300 billion. We're outspending Russia 10 to 15 to 1 on defense. How about troops? Russia has about 1 million, and as we are seeing, not very capable troops. NATO has 3 million active duty, 4 million reserves, about 7 to 1. Aircraft. Russia has about 5,000 tactical and combat capable aircraft. NATO, 28,000. I could go on and on to get the point. NATO, by the way, economically, the 30 nations of NATO are 55% of the world's GDP. The Russian economy, 5%, 3% of global GDP. So Russia is far from 10 feet tall. And we ought to answer your question, we ought to work with our allies. The fact that they're now spending what they should be spending, what they should have been spending, is very capable. And then third and finally, disposition of forces. We need to pay attention to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Sub-Saharan Africa. These are massive population centers. And there it's a marketplace of ideas, as we talked about. So there's a quick sketch map. And I thank you for your great question, being the only Army person in the crowd. That takes real courage. Are we going back here, or you have a microphone? I got you. Oh, you're mic runners. Okay,
Yes.
I see.
Yes, sir.
So who else has a question? I see a bunch of hands going up. How about we stay with midshipmen and then we'll go over here to the grad student. Yes.
Midshipman Second Class Gordy, Naval RPC. So in the past, the power of a nation would keep integrated in its territory. Is territory still the main source of power on the global stage? And if not, what is the global power of a nation not related?
Yeah, what a great question. I kind of the only thoughts on this. One is to take a look at a book by Robert Kaplan called The Revenge of Geography. And it's a book that he wrote to kind of make the point that we are all excited, as we should be, about advances in technology and the way the internet ties us together in our global interconnected economy. All those are valuable things that help determine national power, but geography still matters. The revenge of geography. And so to that point, look at the United States. We enjoy immense advantages from geography. We have these two vast oceans on either side of us, 9 friendly nations to the north and south, a world to the south of Latin America and Caribbean where we have cultural linguistic roots, enormous geographic advantage. Other nations have very poor geography. A good example would be China, which has very little comparably arable land. The United States has almost endless arable land, fresh water, so many advantages, geography. China very constrained in that regard. Russia is this vast landmass, but has no friends to the west, has a kind of difficult relationship with China, truth be told. Geography does not favor Russia. So I think geography, physical presence still matters for nations. Having said all that, increasingly the technology, the research and development, the ability to jumpstart economies, all of that matters legally. So I would say it's a combination of those two things, plus a third element, and this is what I worry about here in the United States of America. You need a cohesive society. And our nation today, let's be honest, is riven with division. And by the way, I'm a centrist, I'm a registered independent, always have been. I was vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton, one of 6 people actually vetted by the campaign. And I was offered a cabinet post by Donald Trump. I think of that, by the way, as 2 bullets whizzing by my head. My point is, I'm a centrist, and when I see the wars in our nation between MSNBC and Fox, it is really deeply concerning. It is, in my view, perhaps our most important security threat. So your question, where does national power come from? Sure, it comes from geography and natural resources. It comes from your technology, your economy, but it also comes from your will, your spirit, your unity. I think we see a pretty positive example of that in Ukraine today. It makes you wonder, could we respond in such a way? I think the jury's out on that. It is, in my view, the great challenge of our times, and you are the ones who saw it. Your generation, I think. And I'll tell you, I had 2 millennial daughters, late 20s, early 30s. They look at both political parties, and they just shake their heads. We have got to get the nation coming together. And I'll close on this point. I said I'm a registered independent. I take that quite seriously as follows. A lot of Americans seem to think that somewhere in the Constitution, Article XX, it says, and there shall be 2 political parties. One shall be Democrat, one shall be Republican. We didn't start out with them. We started out with Whigs, Federalists, Nationalists. We had the Progressive Party. That was Teddy Roosevelt's so-called Bull Moose Party, was a center-right progressive party, a wing, if you will, of the Republican Party at the time. Point being, we've had a lot of political parties in this country. And if the 2 we have can't figure out how to work together more coherently, my view, it's time to go shopping for a new political party in this country. Stay tuned. Others?
Hi, I was just curious, how do you see the U.S.-China relationship evolving in the next 20 years?
Great question. And again, as we've been talking about, really fundamental strategic thread in this century. I think it's going to be relatively quiet for the next 2 to 3 years, and I'll tell you why. Because President Xi is watching what's going on in Ukraine, and he sees 3 things. He sees a very spirited, willful defense by these Ukrainians. Number 2, he sees the Russian armed forces upon whom his armed forces are based. Equipment, doctrine, training, came right out of Soviet doctrine. He's watching that fail. And number 3, President Xi is watching the unity of the West. All 3 of those will, shall we say, curb his enthusiasm for real adventurism or confrontation with the United States. So I think we're in for a relatively quiet 2 to 3 years. Beyond that, it gets more complicated, harder to predict. It will depend in some significant measure on Taiwan and the Taiwanese, on their desires, how they steer their ship of state. I've been to Taiwan many times, met with Madam Tsai, the president. My sense is they will not go quietly into that good night of joining China. China will continue to view them as a rogue province. That's a potential real collision point between the two nations. I think when you get out toward the second decade of the 20 years you asked about, there are a lot of scenarios that are very challenging. Alex was nice enough to mention one of my books. My 10th book is a novel called 2034, a novel of the next World War. It's about a war between the U.S. and China in the year 2034. It's not predictive fiction, it's cautionary fiction. It's a novel about why we need to maintain the technology, why we need to maintain the alliance structure, why we need effective diplomacy, and how we must overcome these divisions at home. If we fail in any of those dimensions, I think the chances for a conflict with China rise, kind of in the 2034 to 24 time period. We must avoid that. And by the way, I have real skin in that game as follows. My son-in-law is Chinese American. He's first generation, child of a man and a woman who came from two different parts of China. He went to Penn. He's went to NYU Medical School. He's a doctor, and he is married to my wonderful Greek American daughter. This is, you know, if you think of it as movies, it's like My Big Fat Greek Wedding meets The Last Emperor. My point is, we need to avoid a war with China for all kinds of very important reasons. I think we got time for Skipper. You tell me one or two more. How are you, sir? Okay, great. Others? Yes, sir. Mike is coming.
The elephant in the room is still the Ukraine-Russian war.
Right.
How do you see that progressing, David and Goliath fighting?
Yeah, we're watching it unfold in real time. I don't know if anybody watches the History Channel, but if you ever watch the History Channel and you see those old black and white montages of the invasion of Poland in 1939, I turn on CNN and I feel I'm watching the History Channel unfold in real time in front of me in 2022. I think the heart of your question is, how does this come out? What happens, right? So I'm going to start with 3 words, and they're not encouraging. The 3 words are no good options. It is unlikely that there's going to be a sweeping victory by the Ukrainians. I find it militarily highly unlikely that the Ukrainians, who are a much smaller nation, your point, David and Goliath, I don't see them being capable of simply pushing a massive Russian armed forces out of the southeast of the country, the so-called Donbass. I don't see an event in Moscow where Putin is overthrown. That's magical thinking. Putin has his hands firmly on the throat of the security apparatus of his nation. He's not going to be overthrown in some sort of magnificent deus ex machina that solves this problem for us. Not going to happen, in my view. What will happen? I think that over the next 4 months or so, the Russians will expend so much human capital and so much of their military stocks that they will start to look for a negotiation. Their negotiated position will be the following. Ukraine, you give us that land bridge that we have fought for since 2014, where significant Russians